Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be carrying on with my Bleak House serialised read-along videos and talking about the chapters that we read in the month of April. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a long-term serialised Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens' amazing novel Bleak House, where we read the book in its original serialised monthly part. So this is coming to its end now. I think the final chapters we'll be reading in September, so not too long to go. And today I'm just going to be talking through the chapters that we read in the month of April. So in the month of April we read the following 4 chapters, which were all very dramatic. Chapter 43. Esther's narrative, Chapter 44, The Letter and the Answer, Chapter 45, In Trust, and Chapter 46, Stop Him. So as usual, I will go through the chapters and have a quick chat about what happened in each of them and a few points of interest in them. So let's start off with Chapter 43, Esther's narrative, in which lots of stuff happens. In Chapter 43, we revisit Esther. She now knows who her mother is and is struggling over this. She's also at the same time struggling with her worries about Richard and what's happening to him, and knowing that he is suffering, that he is in debt, that he is struggling, and that he is broken with Mr. Jarndyce all the more. Esther is also aware that Mr. Skimpole is probably a bad influence on Richard, and if not a bad influence, then at least like a drain on his resources. So she talks to Mr. Jarndyce about this, and she, Mr. Jarndyce, and Ada go to see Mr. Skimpole in his house where he lives with his family. They have rather an odd house where all the furniture is like expensive but really worn because they have no money, but they also have expensive tastes. It's a very odd family situation. Mrs. Skimpole's wife clearly relies quite a lot on Mr. Jarndyce for money, and when they talk to Mr. Skimpole about Richard, Mr. Skimpole pretends as always to be an incredibly innocent man who has no understanding of money at all and doesn't realise that he is draining Richard dry at all. And Esther says that it is very hard when in the company of Mr. Skimpole to imagine that he could possibly be planning or calculating on Richard, and yet when she is out of Mr. Skimpole's company she mistrusts him more and more. And later on in this chapter, Mr. Jarndyce, Ada and Esther receive a call from Sir Leicester Dedlock, which obviously gives Esther quite a fright because she knows that his wife is her mother, and that if he were to find this out it would cause great distress and shame on his family. Esther is quite frightened, especially when Sir Leicester Dedlock basically offers for Mr. Jarndyce and Ada and Esther to come and stay with him because he feels bad that they have been like slighted or not known by him because of his disagreement with his neighbour Mr. Boythorn. And Esther, at the end of the chapter, after Sir Leicester Dedlock is gone, goes to see Mr. Jarndyce basically to explain that there is no way she can go to the Dedlock's house to Chesney Wold because of her relationship with Lady Dedlock and how that must be avoided at all costs, and this is the first time she confides the truth to anyone. And Mr. Jarndyce explains to her when she makes this confession that Esther's aunt, Lady Dedlock's sister, was also the woman who was supposed to marry Mr. Boythorn, who broke off the match with Mr. Boythorn. And that is basically what happens in this chapter. So let me discuss this chapter because there is a lot here to talk about. Firstly, I just want to talk a little bit about like Esther's worries at the beginning of the chapter and the way she talks about it. I think it's very important how she repeats like the same sentence pattern twice. She says, "It matters little now how much I thought of my living mother who had told me evermore to consider her dead." Then the next paragraph begins, "It matters little now how often I recalled the tones of my mother's voice." And that "it matters little now" is repeated to show that it does matter, if you see what I mean, which is one of the kind of clever things Dickens does with that. And we know from these chapters that Esther worries a lot about her mother, not just because she wants to know her and she can't, but also because she feels the awkwardness and the strain of her position, the danger to her mother's reputation if the fact that she is Lady Dedlock's daughter is ever found out. Likewise, Esther's worries about Richard are really moving. She explains that Mr. Jarndyce has written to Richard many times to try and get him to change his mind, and yet our poor devoted Richard was deaf and blind to all. If he were wrong, he would make amends when the Chancery suit was over. He was groping in the dark, he could not do better than do his utmost to clear away those clouds in which so much was confused and obscured. Suspicion and misunderstanding were the fault of the suit, then let him work the suit out and come through it into his right mind. And again, Richard basically believes that there is no way he can do anything in life and make any change in himself or anything else for the better, that there is no way he can settle anything until the suit is settled. Another thing that is very interesting to discuss in this chapter is, of course, Mr. Skimpole, who is quite an interesting character. I've talked before about how much I dislike Mr. Skimpole and how wonderfully I think he's crafted. He's one of Dickens's like very smart, very thoroughly Dickensian character, very exaggerated to the extent that he doesn't necessarily feel believable. And yet I feel like there are lots of people in the world a little bit like Mr. Skimpole, people who kind of say that they understand things less than they do in order to sort of gain advantage from it. And I find like the way Esther kind of sees through him a bit more than everyone else quite interesting. Mr. Jarndyce is a character who is presented throughout the book as being incredibly trusting, and the way he trusts Skimpole and implicitly believes Skimpole is quite interesting and quite telling, I think, of many things about Mr. Jarndyce's personality. Mr. Jarndyce describes Mr. Skimpole as such an unworldly, uncalculating, gossamer creature, and yet that is not how Mr. Skimpole appears to Esther often, and also to the reader, although Esther and the reader are never quite entirely sure. There's a moment when Esther explains that the engaging frankness with which he made this declaration really had a disinterested appearance and captivated my guardian, if not for the moment Ada too. Important, of course, that she does not say that Mrs. Skimpole captivated her. And later Esther says, the more I saw of him, the more unlikely it seemed to me when he was present that he could design, conceal, or influence anything, and yet the less likely that appeared when he was not present, and the less agreeable it was to think of his having anything to do with anyone for whom I cared. And it's interesting in this chapter to see the state of Mr. Skimpole at home when he is not leeching off other people but living on his own, and the particular sort of circumstances of his existence. The house is in a state of dilapidation, and when the servant answers the door to them, she evidently recognises Mr. Jarndyce and indeed associates Mr. Jarndyce with getting her wages because he pays her much more than the Skimpoles do. In many of the rooms there are no furniture because the Skimpoles can't afford any or have had to sell it, and yet in the main room where Mr. Skimpole sits, it was dingy enough and not clean at all, but furnished with an odd kind of shabby luxury, with a large footstool, a sofa and plenty of cushions, an easy chair and plenty of pillows, a piano, books, drawing materials, music and newspapers, and a few sketches and pictures. And there Mr. Skimpole is eating his breakfast, a little plate of hothouse nectarines on the table and another of grapes and another of sponge cakes, and there was a large bottle of wine. Mr. Skimpole himself reclined on the sofa in a dressing gown, drinking some fragrant coffee from an old china cup, it was then about midday, and looking at a collection of wallflowers on the balcony. And when they arrive, Mrs. Skimpole says, "Here I am, this is my frugal breakfast." And yet, what he's having for breakfast is not very frugal, and also still in his dressing gown. Such a picture of idleness and like weird expensive luxury. And the fact that the room is shabby and messy but very luxurious again suggests that this is like where Skimpole has spent money on. And the fact that his daughters and wife are in different rooms is very telling, and perhaps suggests that the rooms in which they spend most of their time are not quite so well furnished. Mr. Skimpole lives his life somewhat as if it is a game, and this is kind of further emphasised by the way he talks about his children. He says, "I have a blue-eyed daughter who is my beauty daughter, I have a sentiment daughter, and I have a comedy daughter." He assigns his daughters roles and doesn't really give them like the full merit of being full human beings. They're just all kind of characters within his world and his game, and he talks about them being as much children as he is, which in a way perhaps they are, because they have not been brought up very much or been educated very much because they have been brought up by such a man. And we also learn that one of his daughters is already married and has 2 young children, and Esther says that she looks very, very young to have 2 children, which I think is a suggestion both of her like childish nature, a bit like her father, and also a suggestion that like her parents haven't looked after her very well, and that she's got married much younger than she should have done because no one has kind of kept an eye on her or watched over her. In general, I think this chapter is quite revealing of Mr. Skimpole, and again kind of gives further thought to Esther's concerns about whether or not Mr. Skimpole is genuinely a man who doesn't understand how the world works and just kind of floats through the world, or whether he is scheming and calculating. And when Esther talks to him, she thinks that he must be genuinely what he says he is, and when she is not there, she doesn't think he is, and she mistrusts him very, very much. And regardless, he is definitely a very bad influence on Richard in terms of spending his money. The other thing that of course is important to talk about in this chapter is the meeting with Sir Leicester Dedlock, and the most interesting thing I think about it is probably Esther's reaction. But before I go on to that, I quickly just want to talk about the fact that Sir Leicester Dedlock comes to visit them and what it shows about his character. I think it shows that Sir Leicester Dedlock is one, very sort of proper and gracious, and also that he is kind and well-meaning, because the reason why Sir Leicester Dedlock comes to see them is because he feels it is improper that he hasn't acknowledged them before, and that he didn't acknowledge them when they were staying with Mr. Boythorn because of his dispute and feud with Mr. Boythorn. And because Mr. Jarndyce is a distant relation of Lady Dedlock, he feels that he has done badly here and that something needs to be done to kind of correct this fault of politeness. And I think it tells you quite a lot about Sir Leicester Dedlock that he feels it is his duty and his responsibility to extend this kindness and this politeness to them, because he feels that they have sort of been snubbed by him unduly and he wants to do the right thing. And we do see, I think, in Sir Leicester Dedlock that while he is a snob, he is also someone who is well-meaning and believes a lot in sort of family ties as well, which is one of the reasons why he reaches out to Mr. Jarndyce here. Esther's reaction is also incredibly important in this chapter. "The visitor was in the room while it was yet turning brown with me, and before I had the power to stir. If I had had it, I should have hurried away. I had not even the presence of mind in my giddiness to retire to Ada in the window, or to see the window, or to know where I was. I heard my name and found that my guardian was presenting me before I could move to a chair. And later she says, I had not once looked up. I had not seen the visitor, and had not even appeared to myself to hear the conversation. It surprises me to find that I can recall it, for it seemed to make no impression on me as it passed. I heard them speaking, but my mind was so confused, and my instinctive avoidance of this gentleman made his presence so distressing to me that I thought I understood nothing through the rushing in my head and the beating of my heart. Finally, I want to touch upon the discussion between Esther and Mr. Jarndyce at the end of the chapter. She goes to explain to him the reason why she cannot see Lady Dedlock and Sir Leicester Dedlock and kind of know them within society. And when she explains why he is very kind to her, and in Esther's words, spoke so tenderly and wisely to me, and put so plainly before me all that I had myself imperfectly thought and hoped in my better state of mind, that penetrated as I had been with fervent gratitude towards him throughout so many years, I believed I had never loved him so dearly, never thanked him in my heart so fully as I did that night. Another thing that is interesting in this chapter, just before I move on to the next one, is what we learn about the past of Miss Barbary, Esther's aunt/godmother who brought her up since she was a child. We learn here that Miss Barbary was engaged to marry Mr. Boythorn, and that she broke it off with him basically in order to raise Esther. Mr. Jarndyce says that Mr. Boythorn did conjecture that some injury which her haughty spirit had received in her cause of quarrel with her sister had wounded her beyond all reason, but she wrote to him that from the date of that letter she died to him, as in literal truth she did, and that the resolution was exacted from her by her knowledge of his proud temper and his strained sense of honour, which were both her nature too. In consideration for those master points in him, and even in consideration for them in herself, she made the sacrifice, she said, and would live in it and die in it. She did both, I fear. Certainly he never saw her, never heard of her from that hour, nor did anyone. And that paragraph, I think, tells you a whole lot about the character of Miss Barbary, who raised Esther. And basically what you learn from this paragraph is that she gave up Mr. Boythorn because she did not think he, being quite a proud man, would be able to live with the disgrace of the fact that her sister has had a child out of wedlock. And also because she herself could barely live with it and could not bear to marry a man of superior rank, having that kind of stain upon their family, as it were, as she considered it, which I think in many ways explains a lot about Miss Barbary's character and the way she brought up Esther, because it explains the degree of sacrifice that she made in order to bring up Esther. And in a way you can see that she took the loss of her future out upon Esther, and also that she was an incredibly sad woman. And I find like the backstory there just really, really sad and very moving and quite cleverly done for being something that is not spoke about at length in this book. But anyway, moving on to chapter 44, the letter and the answer. Quite a significant chapter. In my head this came earlier in the book than it actually does, so this was quite interesting to read. Here we are still in Esther's narrative. This is the next day, following on from the conversation Esther and Mr. Jarndyce had about Lady Dedlock, and they go into a lot more depth and concern about what might possibly happen in the future, and whether or not Lady Dedlock is in any danger of being sort of found out and so on. And before Esther leaves the room, Mr. Jarndyce says to her that there is something he would like to say to her that he has been thinking about saying for a long time, but he hasn't yet. Basically, he says that he would like to write her a letter asking her something, and that no matter what her answer, he will remain the same to her as ever, and kind of assures her of this. And then later on, he sends her a letter in the house asking if she will marry him. And Esther is both like simultaneously happy and sad at this proposal. She like cries a lot, but also has no doubt that she is going to accept him, and she does indeed accept him several days later, and that is basically what happens in this chapter. There is a lot to discuss because this is quite a significant and interesting moment in the book. I don't know where to start in terms of talking about this chapter, because I feel like there's a lot to unpick here and a lot to discuss in terms of the relationship between Mr. Jarndyce and Esther, and how it changes over the course of the book and what this moment means. The first time I ever like experienced Bleak House, as it were, which was not reading the book but watching the 2005 television adaptation, I remember that I really liked Mr. Jarndyce, and then we got to this bit and I was like, no, Mr. Jarndyce, what are you doing? And that is not my reaction now, and I have a lot of different reactions now. And I think Mr. Jarndyce is genuinely one of Dickens's like most carefully crafted and like best characters, and one that I'm really, really fond of. And I think like the relationship between him and Esther is a really, really interesting one within Bleak House, and the reasons why he proposes and the reasons why she says yes are very interesting to think about. One thing I want to just remind readers at this point in time, while I'm talking about this chapter, is that Esther at this stage is in her early to mid-20s. Mr. Jarndyce, I can't remember if his age is explicitly stated, but he's probably about 50, to the best of my knowledge, so there is quite a big age gap between them. While Mr. Jarndyce has never treated Esther as a daughter, she has certainly treated him as a surrogate father through quite a lot of the book, and this obviously is rather a big change in that dynamic. I believe at 1 or 2 points she says to him things like, "You have been kinder than a father could ever be to me," and Mr. Jarndyce like sits there and looks a bit awkward. Which is very interesting if you look back on those moments, because there's at least one moment in the book where she uses the word father and he looks pained, and that is because now we know that Mr. Jarndyce has been in love with Esther for a long time. First, I just want to quickly talk about the conversation they have before Mr. Jarndyce sends that letter to Esther, which I think is quite a powerful conversation and very telling of Mr. Jarndyce's character, that he is so desirous and so emphasising so much that nothing will change but in their relationship and in the house if her answer is no, because Mr. Jarndyce is very keen to impress upon Esther the fact that he does not want to take advantage of her in any way, which I think is quite important because there is this power dynamic issue between them. He has been her guardian, he is still in many ways her guardian, he is a lot older than her, he owns the house in which she lives, and in many ways she is in his power, and that he goes to such lengths to impress upon her that she is not in his power is really, really important, and quite important to his character, I think, as well, and is a very clear way in which Dickens is showing the reader that this is not to do with power, and that Mr. Jarndyce has no wish to have any power over Esther or for that to influence her in any way. Yes, Esther, it is to be forgotten now, to be forgotten for a while. You are only to remember now that nothing can change me as you know me. Can you feel quite assured of that, my dear? I will not write this something in my thoughts until you have quite resolved within yourself that nothing can change me as you know me. If you doubt that in the least degree, I will never write it. If you are quite sure on that consideration, send Charlie to me this night for the letter. If you are not quite certain, never send. Mind, I trust to your truth in this thing as in everything. If you are not quite certain on that point, never send. And this again, I think, is really important because of the level of power their different positions in society and in the house place them in. Mr. Jarndyce stresses it's really important that Mr. Jarndyce stresses that that is not a factor here and that should not be a factor here. I think one thing that is interesting to note here is why Mr. Jarndyce chooses to write a letter rather than just proposing to Esther. They literally live in the same house and they have a lot of conversations all the time. And I think the main reason why Mr. Jarndyce writes a letter is so that she has time to consider and doesn't give her answer immediately. Because I think Mr. Jarndyce slightly knows that Esther's overemphasized sense of gratitude and devotion and loyalty, which is partly to do with the really tricky upbringing she had, might make Esther just say yes at once without thinking. Indeed, it's quite important, I think, that Esther decides immediately that she will accept Mr. Jarndyce, but she doesn't actually do it until a few days later. It's almost as though her and Mr. Jarndyce both want to make sure Esther has time to consider it, and I think that is the reason why he sends her a letter, so that she doesn't say yes at once, because he wants her to consider. And I also think it's probably easier for him, because he does feel a bit awkward and a bit embarrassed. We know that in the letter he dwells upon the fact that he is quite a lot older than her and that he doesn't necessarily have everything to offer her that he would like to, but at the same time he does offer. So the actual letter itself, it's interesting and important that before Esther opens it and reads it, she sits there and thinks about her life and basically has a long hard think about herself, because she knows basically what it will contain. She has guessed from their conversation the night before and something in his manner that slightly changed towards her. And now I opened it and read it. It was so impressive in its love for me and in the unselfish caution it gave me and the consideration it showed for me in every word that my eyes were too often blinded to read much at a time. But I read it through 3 times before I laid it down. I had thought beforehand that I knew its purport, and I did. It asked me if I would be the mistress of Bleak House. It asked me would I be the mistress of Bleak House. It was not a love letter, though it expressed so much love, but it was written just as he would at any time have spoken to me. I saw his face and heard his voice and felt the influence of his kind, protecting manner in every line. It addressed me as if our places were reversed, as if all the good deeds had been mine and all the feelings they awakened his. It dwelt upon my being young, and he past the prime of life, on his having attained a ripe age while I was still a child, on his writing to me with a silvered head, and knowing all this so well as to set it in full before me for mature deliberation. It told me that I would gain nothing by such a marriage, and lose nothing by rejecting it, that for no new relation could enhance the tenderness in which he held me, and whatever my decision, he was certain it would be right. But he did not hint to me that when I had been better looking, he had had this same proceeding in his thoughts and had refrained from it, that when my old face had gone from me and I had no attractions, he could love me just as well as in my fairer days, that the discovery of my birth gave him no shock, that his generosity rose above my disfigurement and my inheritance of shame, that the more I stood in need of such fidelity, the more firmly I might trust in him to the last. But I knew it well now. To devote my life to his happiness was to thank him poorly. And what had I wished for the other night but some new means of thanking him? Still, I cried very much, not only in the fullness of my heart after reading the letter, not only in the strangeness of the prospect, for it was strange though I had expected the contents, but as if something for which there was no name or distinct idea were infinitely lost to me. I was very happy, very thankful, very hopeful, but I cried very much. Now, this is very interesting. There's lots of interesting stuff here to talk about. One thing I want to talk about is the fact that when Esther tells us as readers that Mr. Jarndyce has proposed, the wording she uses is, "It asked me, would I be the mistress of Bleak House?" She doesn't say Mr. Jarndyce asked me if I would be his wife or asked him if I would marry him. She says Mr. Jarndyce asked me if I would be the mistress of Bleak House, which I think is very important. One, it's quite important because we don't actually read the letter in this book. We never see the letter, so we don't know whether that is Esther's phrasing or whether that is Mr. Jarndyce's phrasing, but the phrasing that is chosen here by one of them is not to do with a marriage, it's to do with Esther's position in their household. And in a way, by making Esther his wife, Mr. Jarndyce would be protecting her from all eventualities, securing her future, protecting her from any danger and slander that might occur were it to come out that she is an illegitimate child of Lady Dedlock, and also kind of securing the fact that Esther can remain living in Bleak House with Mr. Jarndyce even were Ada to leave the house and marry Richard, which if Ada did leave the house, it would be improper for Esther to stay on her own unless she were married to Mr. Jarndyce. And to make Esther the mistress of Bleak House is to give her wealth and social position and also to give her a home, which is very important, I think, because we often in this book look at the theme of home and the fact that Esther kind of feels displaced, that Bleak House becomes her home after not having sort of had a home through a lot of her life. So I think the phrasing used here is very, very significant because it makes the marriage not just about the relationship between two of them, but about Esther's position in the world, which in many ways it is. Mr. Jarndyce, when he writes the letter asking Esther to be his wife, offers her marriage, but also offers her two different possibilities of marriage. He does love her, and he offers her the possibility of a romantic love match, marriage, but also of the chance to be his wife, be the mistress of his home, but with the knowledge that she might not love him as he loves her, which I think is quite interesting. It's important that Esther says that it's not a letter full of love. It is a letter offering a marriage of comfort and companionship, but not necessarily full of passionate love, because Mr. Jarndyce knows that that is not what Esther might feel for him. And indeed, when Esther says that it is as if something for which there was no name or distinct idea were indefinitely lost to me, perhaps what is lost to her is a future of a romantic marriage. And she talks a little bit in this chapter about Mr. Woodcourt. At least she thinks of Mrs. Woodcourt making a prediction a while ago, and she thinks of the flowers that she has pressed before that belonged to Mr. Woodcourt that now she is going to have to get rid of because she is going to marry Mr. Jarndyce. And she also thinks as well, as she stands over Ada's bed and drops tears on Ada's face, as you do when someone's asleep, she thinks of Ada's love for Richard, and it's important that she thinks of that there because the love between Richard and Ada is of a very different sort to the love between Esther and Mr. Jarndyce, and certainly the love that Ada feels towards Richard is not the same kind of love or the same strength of love that Esther feels towards Mr. Jarndyce. Esther makes up her mind that night after reading the letter. She says to herself, when you are mistress of Bleak House, you are to be cheerful as a bird. Again, note that she says when you are mistress of Bleak House to herself, not when you are Mr. Jarndyce's wife. Yet she leaves a week before she goes to see Mr. Jarndyce, and while Mr. Jarndyce struggles to speak the words to her, she struggles to write the words to him. But she goes in at the end of the chapter to tell him his answer. And this, I think, this passage is really, really significant. Guardian, I said, rather hesitating and trembling, when would you like to have the answer to the letter Charlie came for? When it's ready, my dear, he replied. I think it is ready, said I. Is Charlie to bring it? He asked pleasantly. No, I have brought it myself, Guardian, I returned. I put my 2 arms around his neck and kissed him, and he said, was this the mistress of Bleak House? And I said yes, and it made no difference presently, and we all went out together, and I said nothing to my precious pet about it. Never has there been like an author for saying so much in so few words and in such a subtle small scene which tells us so many things. Interesting here, many things. One is that Esther still calls him guardian because in her head, if she marries him, he is still her guardian, sort of within Victorian ideology, and also because their relationship has not yet changed. It's very significant too that she says nothing to Ada about it, and that she does not tell Ada, and neither does Mr. Jarndyce. They are now engaged to be married, but they keep this fact very close to their chests and do not tell anyone, which is important. And also, the very important thing here is that Esther puts her arms around his neck and kisses him. So, one thing I think is important to note here in terms of like uses of kissing in Victorian literature. Often in Victorian literature, or often in 19th century literature as a whole, when someone kisses someone else, that often means on the cheek and not on the lips. In general, like now in modern language, if you use the word kiss, you mean kiss on the mouth, whereas that is not necessarily what is used in Victorian literature. However, in Victorian literature, if it says that someone puts their arms around someone and kisses them, or takes someone in their arms and kisses them, that's like Victorian shorthand for like a proper romantic kiss. I think it's very important here that Esther's answer to Mr. Jarndyce is to properly kiss him, because what she says in that is not just I'm going to marry you, but also I don't want this to just be like a marriage of convenience where you're just giving me social position. I want this to be like a proper marriage. We're gonna be in love. I will love you in that way. I will try, and we will like be together properly, like as a romantic couple, not just man and wife, which I think is very important here. And also important that she is the one that kisses him, not him kissing her, and that is how she gives her answer. Another thing I think we should talk about in this chapter is why does Esther accept Mr. Jarndyce? Because this is very important and very complicated, and I think there are many reasons. As readers, we know that she was a little bit in love with Mr. Woodcourt, and we also know that she is not really in love with Mr. Jarndyce. Certainly not in the way she was in love with Mr. Woodcourt. That is not the impression we've got so far, but we do know that she loves Mr. Jarndyce very much, even perhaps if not quite in the way that he loves her, or perhaps indeed in the way that he would like her to love him. Although it's very important, again, as I just noted, that when she accepts him and says she will marry him, she makes it very clear that this is not just about like social position. She kisses him to say, you know, I will love you, I will try. So I think in that sense, part of the reason why Esther does accept Mr. Jarndyce is because he is one of her favourite people in the world and she really loves him. And even if she doesn't love him in the right way, she thinks she can because she is so fond of him. But I think she also accepts Mr. Jarndyce out of gratitude and out of devotion and loyalty and the knowledge that her life has been happy because of him. And also because it does give her protection and it does give her social position, and it gives her a home which she has always wanted, and a home that she loves, a house that she adores, and a position in life which she knows she will enjoy. It gives her a life and a secure future, which is something she has never had. And I don't think that Esther accepts Mr. Jarndyce out of like mercenary motives, but I do think the security of it and the sense of a home and a future is very important to her. And in a way, I think she accepts Mr. Jarndyce because she's so fond of him that she could not bear to say no. But I think it's really interesting to look at why Esther does accept Mr. Jarndyce. So I think it's very interesting because I think there are a lot of reasons why she does, and I think it's very easy because Esther is presented as such a kind of figure of devotion and loyalty and gratitude to think that Esther basically accepts Mr. Jarndyce out of gratitude as a way to kind of repay a debt. But I think there's a lot more going on there, and I think there is a lot more that is complicated and important in there, especially because, as I said, she is the one at the end of the chapter who kisses him properly to like show that this is not just out of gratitude that she is going to love him. So I think this is really important and very interesting, and there's a lot to say about that chapter. So yeah, I think that's probably been enough of a rant about Esther and Mr. Jarndyce. I'd be very interested to know in the comments what people think of this and how this affected how they saw Esther and Mr. Jarndyce, because certainly my view on this relationship has changed like a lot over like my many rereads of Bleak House and rewatches of the adaptation. So yeah, be interested to know your thoughts. But anyway, let's move on to chapter 45, In Trust. In chapter 45, Mr. Vowles comes to see Mr. Jarndyce to basically say that Richard is in a bad way and that there's not very much money and Mr. Vowles wants to be paid. So Mr. Jarndyce basically commissions Esther to go off and find Richard, thinking that she is the best person to have luck to kind of persuade Richard to get his affairs in order and just to see if anything can be done and if Esther can help him in any way. So she heads off to where Richard is stationed with the army, and when Esther arrives, she finds that Richard is in the middle of packing up all his things because he is about to leave the army, go back to London, give up his profession and work solely on solving the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which is of course not great for anybody involved. Esther tries to persuade him, but he is adamant. And then towards the end of the chapter, someone else turns up who Esther knows in the same place, and that is Mr. Woodcourt, who has now returned from sea and is going back to London, which obviously startles Esther a little bit because she used to be rather a little bit in love with Mr. Woodcourt, so that's rather important and interesting. He is obviously not exactly shocked, but very sorry to see that she has been so ill, and also very worried about Richard. And Esther gets Mr. Woodcourt to promise that in London he will be a friend to Richard and try and guide Richard if he can, which he very solemnly promises to do. So, points of interest in this chapter. I feel like most of the points of interest in this chapter are in the latter half. I feel like I've already spoken about Mr. Bowles, and there's not much new to say in this chapter apart from the fact that he is both at pains to kind of get everything he can from the situation, but also to stress that it's not necessarily for himself, but for his family. I think it's important to discuss Richard's appearance when Esther first comes to his lodgings. He was at a writing table with a great confusion of clothes, tins, cases, books, boots, brushes and portmanteaus strewn all about the floor. He was only half dressed, in plain clothes I observed, not in uniform, and his hair was unbrushed, and he looked as wild as his room. All this I saw after he had heartily welcomed me, and I was seated near him, for he started upon hearing my voice and caught me in his arms in a moment. Dear Richard, he was ever the same to me, down to, poor, poor fellow, to the end. He never received me but with something of his old merry boyish manner. I really enjoy Esther and Richard's friendship. I've spoken about this before, how there aren't that many like male-female platonic friendships in Victorian literature, and the relationship between Esther and Richard I really, really love, because they're just really, really good friends and they really care about each other, and Esther just like is so desperate to try and help him if she can, and she just can't. And that is really sad, but it's really like powerfully drawn and important as well. I also think this is just an incredibly sad chapter of Richard's kind of despondency, his hopelessness, when he says it is all over here and talks about how useless the military has made him. He says, I am away on leave this day, should be gone in another hour, and that is to smooth it over for the sellings out. Well, let bygones be bygones. So this calling follows the rest. I only want to have been in the church, to have made a round of all the professions. I'm just so near disgrace as that those who are put in authority over me would far rather be without me than with me. And from this we learn that Richard is more or less ruined and doesn't really know what to do with himself, and from this we learn that Richard is more or less ruined and doesn't really know what to do with himself at all, except that he is going to leave the army and go back to London. And nothing that Esther can do can persuade him otherwise, not even when the letter that Esther brings from Ada offers Richard all of Ada's fortune to make him stay in the army. He says he can't do that, but he is ashamed of himself and he is ashamed of his behaviour towards Ada because he does love her. He kisses the letter, and when Esther tells him that Ada's is a noble heart, he says, I'm sure it is. I wish I was dead. Which is pretty strong, that he knows that the way he has treated Ada and the life he lives is not right, but he doesn't know how to fix it except by getting the suit resolved, because that is the only thing he can think about. If every farthings of Ada's little fortunes were mine, no part of it should be spent in retaining me in what I am not fit for, can take no interest in, and am weary of. It should be devoted to what promises a better return, and should be used where she has a larger stake. Still, he thinks that if he had Ada's money, he would use it towards the cause and the suit. Now let us move on to the moment where she recognises Mr. Woodcourt, because this is quite important. The fact that the moment she hears Mr. Woodcourt's voice, she runs away with Charlie and she kind of is afraid of meeting him, I think is quite important to show the effect that he still has on her. There are kind of two reasons why she dreads meeting Mr. Woodcourt. It's partly because she's acknowledged to herself that she was once a little bit in love with him, and because she knows that her face has changed dramatically, that she has been very disfigured by her illness, but also it's because she was once a little bit in love with him and she has just engaged herself to another man. And we know that she is concerned about her appearance because when she first talks to Mr. Woodcourt, she puts her veil half down and then puts it up again during their conversation. He came immediately. I told him I was rejoiced to be by chance among the first to welcome him home to England, and I saw that he was very sorry for me. And this is the wording that Esther repeats several times in this chapter, that Mr. Woodcourt is sorry for her, which I think is Esther's way of kind of thinking that he is sad that her appearance has changed because he no longer feels the same way. But I think to a reader is not really quite so simple, and is maybe just that he is very sad that she was ill because he cares about her. And when Esther says he was so sorry for me that he could scarcely speak, we do wonder as readers whether he can scarcely speak because he pities her, or because he can scarcely speak because Mr. Woodcourt is still perhaps a little bit in love with her. It's also important too to note that Mr. Woodcourt is worried about Richard. He had a perception that all was not going well with him. He frequently glanced at his face as if there was something in it that gave him pain. He says to Esther, "I never saw so remarkable a look in a young person. One cannot say it is all anxiety or all weariness, yet it is both, and like ungrown despair." And he promises Esther very faithfully that he will look after Richard in London and be a friend to him, and whether he promises this for Esther's sake or for Richard's, it is hard to tell. But this chapter ends with Esther thinking back on Mr. Woodcourt. "In his last look as we drove away, I saw that he was very sorry for me, and I was glad to see it. I felt for my old self as the dead may feel if they ever revisit these scenes. I was glad to be tenderly remembered, to be gently pitied, not to be quite forgotten." And indeed, she is not. So, moving on to the final chapter in this section, chapter 46, Stop Him. To quickly explain what happens in this chapter, we're back in London, we follow Mr. Woodcourt, and we follow him as he encounters Jenny, the brickmaker's wife, and also Jo, and learns a little bit more from Jo about where Esther's illness came from, and also why Jo fled so fast after he was helped at Bleak House. So, points of interest in this chapter. I just wanted to mention as well, I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but I read somewhere that one of the considered titles for Bleak House before settling on Bleak House was Tom All Alone's. And I think it's quite important that Tom All Alone's has this kind of significant role within Bleak House as this kind of place of despair, and that it is Tom All Alone's that is the real, like, bleak home within this novel, whereas Bleak House is not. And it is Tom All Alone's that is very bleak. And important too, I think, that it's called Tom All Alone's, and that Tom Jarndyce is the relation of Mr. Jarndyce, who killed himself in Crook's shop all that time ago. The kind of sense of that name and the misery surrounding it is important here. Darkness rests upon Tom All Alone's, dilating and dilating since the sun went down last night. It has gradually swelled until it fills every void in the place. For a time there were some dungeon lights burning, as the lamp of light burns in Tom All Alone's, heavily, heavily in the nauseous air and winking, and that lamp too winks in Tom All Alone's, so many horrid things, but they are blotted out. The moon has eyed Tom with a dull, cold stare, as admitting some puny emulation of herself in his desert region unfit for life and blasted by volcanic fires, but she has passed on and is gone. The blackest nightmare in the infernal stables grazes on Tom All Alone's, and Tom is fast asleep. And near Tom All Alone's, who should we encounter but Mr. Woodcourt, who is looking around him in compassion, fearing for the poor, and who should he come across but Jenny, the brickmaker's wife, who we have met before, whom he tries to help. She is waiting on a doorstep for the sun to come and warm her. She says she has been walking a long time and does not know what to do. And there's a good sort of bond strikes up between Mr. Woodcourt and Jenny. She trusts him basically because he doesn't patronise her. A habit in him of speaking to the poor and of avoiding patronage or condescension or childishness, which is a favourite device, many people deeming it quite a subtlety to talk to them like spelling books, has put him on good terms with the woman easily. He talks to her like a human being, and therefore she trusts him, especially when she learns that he is a doctor and he tries to help her. She has been hurt and bruised by her husband. And after Mr. Woodcourt leaves Jenny, he finds Jo and is surprised to find himself slightly recognising this boy, and all the more surprised when Jenny runs after Jo and says, "Stop him." And Mr. Woodcourt manages to catch Jo for Jenny to talk to him, and Jenny explains that Jo was very kind to her, but that she has no idea why he ran off so suddenly, and that she has been looking for him ever since. And when Mr. Woodcourt mentions that he once saw Jo at an inquest, Jo says, "Yes, I see you once before at the inquest. What of it? Can't you never let an unfortunate as me alone? Ain't I unfortunate enough for you yet? How unfortunate do you want me for to be? I've been chivied and chivied, first by one of you and next by the other, until I'm worried to sticks and bones. The inquest weren't my fault. I done nothing. He was very good to me, he was. He was the only one I know to speak to as ever came across my crossing. It ain't very likely I would want him to be inquished. I only wish I was myself. I don't know why. I don't go and make a hole in the water, I'm sure I don't." So another sad aspect of this section is Jo's life and Jo's misery, and we find out now a little more about Jo and why he ran away from Esther. But we also see very interestingly here how Mr. Woodcourt is distressed by learning that Jo was the cause of Esther's illness, and how he kind of struggles to control himself because he is angry and also because he is upset. And we see in this chapter where it's the first kind of like prolonged bit where we see Mr. Woodcourt from his own perspective in third person, which I think is quite important because we do see how much like Esther has affected him and how much he does care about Esther. And then Jo explains that he was took away, that he did not run away from Esther, that he never knew that she was ill, that he would never want to hurt her and he would sooner have hurt himself. And he also explains that he did not leave willingly that night and that he was taken away. And he tells Mr. Woodcourt who took him away. We as a reader do not hear the name, but we do hear Mr. Woodcourt say, "Why? What have you been doing?" And at the end of the chapter, Mr. Woodcourt takes Jo off to try and help him elsewhere, and Jo asks Mr. Woodcourt and Jenny again to tell the young lady that he never meant to hurt her. And I think it's important and interesting as well that throughout this chapter, Mr. Woodcourt is not referred to as Mr. Woodcourt, but as Alan. In my head, he is Mr. Woodcourt, so I'm going to call him Mr. Woodcourt, but he is referred to as Alan, which I think is important because in general, when Dickens uses a character's first name rather than their surname, it's a little signifier that they are someone that you should have sympathy with and someone that you should care about. And I think that's all there is to say about that chapter and all there is to say about April's chapters of Bleak House. So, in the month of May, which is already underway, we will be reading the following 3 chapters. We will be reading chapter 47, Jo's Will, chapter 48, Closing In, and chapter 49, Dutiful Friendship. Lots of exciting chapters to come. We're getting closer to the end of Bleak House. And that is, I think, all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you enjoyed this video and what you thought of these chapters in Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.